Good evening, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Kingston. I'm the president of the National Capital Branch of the Canadian International Council. We are delighted to be co-hosting this event entitled Recent Changes in China, a conversation with Nathan VanderKlippe with the Centre for International Policy Studies of the University of Ottawa. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Long before today, as we gather here, there have been Aboriginal peoples who have been the stewards of this place. In particular, we acknowledge the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions of Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples who have made both in shaping and strengthening this community in particular, and our province and country as a whole. The Canadian International Council is represented by 18 branches across Canada, an online publication known as Open Canada, and a massive project ensuring that decision makers know what citizens are thinking about foreign policy. The CIC equips Canadians to surmount the challenges of an ever-changing and sometimes perilous world. Much of this work is done by volunteers, but it nevertheless attracts considerable costs. I invite you to click on the link to donations in the chat at the bottom of the screen and contribute to the Council's work. I also invite you to join one of the 18 branches across the country to continue to ensure the excellence in programming that the CIC offers. I would at this time also like to congratulate Maureen O'Neill, who has most recently become the chair of the board of CIC National. The flagship event this evening is welcoming over 400 participants from across Canada and from 17 countries. We are honored to welcome Nathan VanderKlippe during the final days of his 8-year assignment in Asia with the Globe and Mail, based in Beijing. Margaret McQuaig-Johnson of the CIC National Capital Region Board of Directors and Professor Scott Simon, representing CIPS at the University of Ottawa, will be the discussants with Nathan for the next hour and will pose your questions. You may consult the bios of Margaret and Scott in the event invitation. I would also ask you to please use the question button at the bottom of the screen to present any questions, and we will do our best to answer as many as possible in the time allotted. I'd also like to thank Sam and Carolina for their work in organizing this session. So Margaret, the floor is yours to introduce our speaker, Nathan VanderKlippe. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. It's my honor to introduce Nathan VanderKlippe as our guest speaker this evening. We're very fortunate that he's agreed to speak to us during his final days as the Globe and Mail's Asia correspondent, culminating 8 years bringing us page one above the fold stories day after day. Nathan has been our eyes and ears during an historic time in China's development. He has brought us compelling stories from the Uyghur camps in Xinjiang to the streets of Hong Kong to the briefing room of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nathan has a rich and deep career in Canadian issues before he took the Globe's highly respected China job. His career before the Globe was in print and TV positions in Western Canada, based in Calgary, Vancouver, and Yellowknife. He's covered Canada's energy industry, Aboriginal issues, and Canada's North. Nathan has won many Canadian and international awards, including just last month from the World Press Freedom Canada and the Norman Webster Award for International Reporting. For our event this evening, Nathan will give some short introductory remarks rather than a formal presentation, and then I'll pose some issues and questions for Nathan to speak to on the changes and challenges we're seeing in China. And then my colleague and fellow member of the Asia Studies Network at the University of Ottawa, Professor Scott Simon, will pose issues and questions related to Asia more broadly. Scott's own area of academic focus is Taiwan and Japan. Ben will open it up for questions from the audience, so feel free to pose your questions in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So Nathan, over to you.
Hello, everyone, and good evening. I'm speaking to you today from Urumqi in Xinjiang, where I've come for, excuse me, one last reporting trip. I had expected to be back in Beijing, but got delayed yesterday by some things that are very unique to Xinjiang, which include regular road check stops. I think I went through 7 or 8 different check stops yesterday, at which I had to register and show information and all the rest. I imagine there'll be some questions from Xinjiang, so I'm here. Maybe I can just say very quickly something that actually a video editor at the Globe had asked me in a short video piece they did for our website, which was to talk about 3 things, perhaps 3 takeaways from my time in China. And just briefly, what I came up with was China's full of surprises, China is ambitious, and we ignore China at our peril. And I can speak to that very quickly. But in terms of China being full of surprises, I think one of the things that has struck me is that China, of course, is a huge country, but China as a country, even in terms of the way its people interact, the way its government interacts, is far from monolithic. And it's probably stating the obvious to many people on this call, but I think it is incumbent upon us as people in business, as people in government, as everyday citizens, to try to understand some of the various facets of China. I mean, China is a place that locks up people like Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor in a political dispute with Canada. It's also a place where, when I arrived in China with 2-year-old children who were very loud and cried on airplanes, where people would literally offer to take my children and sort of give me an hour's rest on an airplane. It's a place where here in Xinjiang, there are routine check stops that remind you of the worst elements of perhaps China of old, or of what we imagine police states to be in North Korea and elsewhere. It's also a place where, among its own citizens, people will tell you they feel a great degree of freedom. And so I think it's valuable for us to see China in those facets, including trying to appreciate how people inside China see China, because that often influences the way China's government functions. In terms of China's ambition, I think we need to be clear-eyed about that. We need to be clear-eyed about the ways in which China is seeking to become a global leader in a whole variety of different areas, whether it's from the perspective of military strength, whether it's the perspective of corporate strength, whether it's from the perspective of international influence, and that sort of thing. I think we also need to be clear-eyed about the ways in which China is succeeding at that, and the ways China is succeeding at changing life, for example, for its own people in ways that they appreciate. When you speak with particularly young people from China who spend time overseas, they will now tell you that they feel that life in China tends to be more convenient than life in other places. I mean, China has invested heavily in transportation that far eclipses what we see in many Western countries in terms of its conveniences. The willingness of people in China to embrace change and to embrace things that are new, which allows for sort of a powerful ability of China's entrepreneurs and its companies to move into new areas. These are all elements of a very ambitious China. And then finally, I think related to those is that we ignore China at our peril. It has struck me often in my time here in China that there are many elements in Canada, for very good historical reasons, that continue to see Canada both as a North American and as an Atlantic nation. And this notion of Canada as a Pacific nation is one that, of course, exists, but has been a secondary concern. And China has a way, I think, of making itself felt whether people want that to be the case or not. And this is the case when it comes to lines of supply for corporations and the types of labor that's used in those lines of supply. That's true for consumers in terms of, when you have large numbers of Uyghur workers that are being dispatched to factories both across Xinjiang and across China, I think that raises very serious questions about the types of labor that are employed in supply lines that create the goods that corporations and consumers use. And so I think it's valuable to continue thinking about China. And while China poses difficult questions, I remember speaking with a diplomat here once who said, in many ways, diplomatically, Russia is easy because you can ignore Russia. Russia has a small economy. Russia can be in many ways shunted to the side. In many cases with Russia, you can just say no. That's not the case with China. China poses very, very complicated questions, but sort of ignoring those questions, I don't think is a valid option, and I think will be even less so as we go forward. So, with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
That's great. Thanks, Nathan. And I'd like to start the discussion by going into the shift that we've seen in Canada-China relations in recent years. You arrived in Beijing during the later years of the Harper government when the earlier frostiness was over and there were big business opportunities for Canadian companies. But we had the detention of Kevin and Julia Garrett in 2014, and Kevin ultimately spent more than 2 years in detention and prison. Prime Minister Trudeau had a great visit in 2016 and started exploratory talks for an FTA, but that was rejected in 2017. And then Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, as you say, were detained and imprisoned, and China's reputation in Canada plummeted. And so that's essentially what we've been seeing on our side of the Pacific. During all of this, you were tracking the issues for us from the China side of the Pacific. And how did you experience this as a Canadian journalist? What were you seeing in this whole transformation?
Well, I mean, I think one of the interesting things that we have seen is that the trade numbers have largely been unaffected. There was a dip in 2019 after the detention of the Michaels and after China blocked the movement of some key Canadian agricultural goods, canola chief among them. But if you look back at the trade numbers during the Harper era, for example, there was, when it comes to China, there was in many ways two chapters to the Harper era. There was sort of the, hostile chapter, and there was the more friendly chapter. The trade numbers just sort of ticked up without any change. I mean, you would not be able to look at the trade numbers and be able to discern which was a friendlier era and which was a more hostile era. And we have seen now quite a significant recovery in terms of the trade between Canada and China. So all of those things seem to continue apace, and certainly the appetite for deals and for trade with China on the corporate sector seems to have come back. I think one of the things that has really changed, in particular, it's interesting because the Kevin and Julia Garrett case, it now seems clear, was quite similar to the case of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, in that the Garretts were detained after a Chinese national was arrested in Canada for extradition to the United States. A man named Su Bin, who was arrested and then ultimately extradited to the US and sentenced on charges that related to the theft of US military secrets. And of course, we now have a situation where we have another Chinese national in Canada arrested and up for extradition to the United States. But that linkage was not as obvious at the time in terms of Kevin and Julia Garrett. And as a result, it did not have the chilling effect that what has happened more recently has had. And I think from a personal perspective, it has been striking to me the degree to which there has been a personal fear in terms of Canadians in traveling to China after the arrest of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. And of course, that is combined with, as you mentioned, an incredible shift in Canadian public opinion toward China. I mean, if you track some of the Canadian public opinion, favorability perception among Canadians toward China had drawn roughly to even, in some cases almost towards a majority. So China had, over the course of 20 years, effectively succeeded in winning the favor of the Canadian public in more or less large measure. And that is dramatically shifted. You now have historic numbers of negative perception toward China. How that changed very quickly to the negative, I suspect that will take a long time to shift back towards the positive if it ever does. And I suspect that will also have long-term ramifications in terms of Canada and China's political relations, because those in many ways tend to follow public perception. And so as a journalist, it's been interesting to see, because within weeks of the detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, you had the grand opening in Beijing of the Canada Goose flagship store, and there were huge lineups outside. And you've had, over the course of their detention, you've had sort of the opening and rollout of Tim Hortons, which in China at least just drapes itself in the maple leaf. Their shops are covered in maple leaves and hockey sticks and the rest. And I know it's not a Canadian-owned company anymore, but it very much bills itself as a Canadian brand, and that has proceeded apace. And I think we have seen that in other cases as well, where there is a gap between Chinese consumers and the Chinese government. So it's been interesting to see both of those. We're both a fear that has taken place. I mean, after the detention of the two Michaels, you had Canadian executives effectively fleeing China and being very concerned about coming back. You've had people with business interests in China that are worried that they may never come back, where at the same time, there are other elements that have gone full steam ahead that don't seem to have been affected.
And you tracked the cases of the Michaels very closely, their trials and so on. And do you hold out some hope for them and their situation? And the other four who have execution sentences as well.
I mean, I think history has shown two things. One, that the large majority of extradition cases with people who are up for extradition to the US result in extradition. And two, that a well-funded defense in an extradition case can make a case drag on for a very, very long time indeed. And so it strikes me that much of this is likely to hinge on what happens with Meng Wanzhou in Canada. And some of those factors would suggest that either this case goes on for a very long time, or that ultimately Xi is extradited to the United States. We've seen the Canadian ambassador, Dominic Barton, obviously spending time in the US, both in his recent visit, but also previously. He's been in the US previously, speaking with US interests about the case, trying to see if there might be something to be done there. There have been these deferred prosecution agreement talks between Huawei and the US Justice Department that don't appear to have gone anywhere. But there's obviously been a hope by the Canadian government that there can be some solution achieved using the United States as opposed to using China in particular. I know there are diplomats here in China who continue to hold out hope that the Chinese side will come to an understanding that the detention of these two men has not been in China's interest in terms of what it's done for China's reputation, in terms of what it has done for China's interactions with other countries, because of course we've seen European leaders, EU leaders also bring this up as a cause for concern. We've seen dozens of other countries sign on to this Canadian initiative to condemn arbitrary detention, which is hostage diplomacy effectively. And so there is some hope on the Canadian side that can change. But I mean, we have a real sort of, on the Chinese side, an immensity of sort of political force that seems to be behind the idea that that there needs to be a very strong price paid for a country that is willing to detain an important Chinese national, an important symbol of China's corporate interests. And I don't know the degree to which any sense of the way this is affecting China's image, for example, would be enough to cause China to change course on its own.
Okay, good. Now, the other big story that you've brought to us almost daily is Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. So you've focused a lot on that. The camps and the transportation of Uyghurs across China to work in factories. What are the key things that have stood out for you in a general sense? And then later we'll get into some specific questions about that.
I mean, I think a couple of things have really stood out. One is the scale of this. And I remember standing outside some of these, what we tend to call Reeducation centers and what China calls vocational skills training centers. They're effectively forcible political indoctrination centers, many of which are now empty, although not all. But in sort of the heights of that element of this campaign, because there have been a series of different elements that I've preceded. In the heights of that chapter, I was standing outside several of these, and they were huge, just very, very large facilities, surrounded by walls, surrounded by razor wire, surrounded by watchtowers. I remember driving past one at night, and it was just bathed in floodlights. It was a very striking symbol of the degree to which that this was a center for incarceration. And I think the scale of what has taken place, the fact that you have facilities like that all over Xinjiang that took place, some of which were very, very large, were effectively had sort of in some ways apartment tower style accommodation for large numbers of people. I think that has struck me. I think the ways in which this has changed and the ways in which this has dug in such depth into the cultural and personal lives of minority peoples in Xinjiang. The idea that you have had officials coming into people's homes on these so-called sort of family style visits in which officials are meant to team up with locals, but effectively visits that end up acting as surveillance and bringing the state deep into people's homes. The idea that you've had such an immensity of effort put into preventing births under the guise of this family planning policy in China, but which has created just an incredible fall off in the numbers of births and an incredible rise in the numbers of medical procedures to prevent further births. And in fact, there's a long-standing program in Xinjiang to reward women for early sterilization and that sort of thing. And that's been taking place for a long time. There's cash rewards for that sort of thing. And then the immensity of these programs to move workers, this excess labor transfer, as China calls it, to take people out of rural places and move them into either urban or industrial settings to work. And China, of course, says these people sign contracts and they're there voluntarily. But we also know that in a state like the way Xinjiang is, that to refuse an official request can cause consequences, both for individuals and for individuals' families. And so I think there are very, very profound and important questions to be asked about the degree to which any of that can possibly be voluntary, and then what that means.
Yes, so thank you for all your reporting on that, and we'll get into the more specifics in the Q&A section. I'd like to turn now to my colleague, Scott Simon, who has some questions and issues related to China's relations with neighboring countries.
Excuse me. So first of all, I'll ask some questions of my own, and then we can move on to some questions from the audience. But I wanted to ask you about more about some military issues here. And one of them is rather much more general, that we're seeing on some of the open source intelligence sites that China is massively expanding its air combat capacity footprint in the far western part of the country. So near the border with India. But then there's also the South China Sea, and then there have been also increasing incursions around the Senkaku Islands that belong to Japan. So how does that fit in with Xi's vision, the chair of China, for the place of China in the world, in the Indo-Pacific?
My sense is what Xi wants is for China to be able to pursue its vision, and in particular its territorial vision, the ability to pursue that vision unchallenged. Whether China exercises that or not, who knows? But what we've seen in, for example, in China's missile development, what we have seen in China's rhetoric around the degree of its military readiness, is a sense that it wants to be able to make the argument that it has the ability to push back anyone who would challenge its vision, most notably, of course, the United States, which is why you've seen efforts to sort of create capacity that would limit the ability of, for example, US aircraft carriers to operate close to Taiwan, and to be able to undermine that, which of course would make a US response much more difficult in the case of anything happening with Taiwan. With India, of course, what we have seen is we have seen all of these pushes in various areas, both in terms of a military response, but also in terms of the Chinese, the civil military response in terms of road building and elsewhere, which we've also, of course, seen in Bhutan, which we've also seen in terms of the way fishing ships are used as an extension of Chinese sovereignty in waters near the Philippines. And so we've seen all of these different elements working to allow China to promote and inhabit what it sees as its proper territorial space. The problem, of course, is that there are other people who don't see that as China's proper territorial space, and in fact see it as their own. And so as China increases its military power, it also increases its ability to assert what it sees as its own motherland.
Okay. So I think that a big concern recently has been the military incursions around Taiwan. And in fact, on June 15th, so just 2 days ago, 28 military planes were sent into Taiwanese airspace to the south of the island, after the G7 called for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So how is Taiwan reacting to that, and where do you see this going?
I mean, this is one of, I think, the crucial questions. Where do you see this going? And there are huge differences of opinion on this. You have seen the US military putting out warnings that suggest that the risk of a hot conflict over Taiwan is not just real, but growing increasingly imminent, that this is not a distant possibility, but a more imminent one. I think sometimes some of those projections need to be viewed with some skepticism because, of course, there's the more menacing the threat, the more useful it is to achieve larger budgets. But that said, I mean, we have obviously seen over the course of the last year a great deal of Chinese military activity around Taiwan. These incursions across the center line, which had historically been a line that was largely respected by the Chinese side and is no longer. What does this mean on the Taiwan side? Of course, it's been met with a huge amount of consternation and a huge desire on the Taiwanese side to marshal international condemnation of what's happening in China, to marshal a sense from the international community that China can't operate in this way with some sort of impunity. On the Chinese side, what are the objectives? I mean, the founding mission, effectively, the central mission of the People's Liberation Army is Taiwan. This is the scenario that sits at the basis of Chinese military planning. Other objectives are secondary. We've seen this in all kinds of ways. We've seen exercises to invade the Taiwanese presidential palace on Chinese soil, and that was years ago already. And so, what happens? At what point does China say that its efforts to woo Taiwan have failed and that only a more hostile approach will happen? China, of course, has never disavowed that possibility. Is that imminent? Is that not? I really find that hard to say. I mean, we still have China working very hard to try to bring effectively Taiwan into its fold. And there is a sense on the Chinese side that this is inevitable, that China's economic and cultural rise will make it irresistible to the people of Taiwan. And my sense is that still dominates, as opposed to a sense that this needs to be done by force. Could that change? Yes, and if it does change, I suspect it would change very quickly. I mean, we need look only to Hong Kong to see how quickly China's policy to some of its more outlying territories can change, and the results of what that can be.
There's been some concern about the national security law and the idea that this is some kind of a new policy of extraterritoriality. How do you perceive that?
Yeah, there is that element. Of course, there's that risk. China, I think, in many ways, when we look at the way China is comporting itself in the international arena, I think we can often see China seeking to follow what it sees as U.S. precedent, because there is a sense in China that if it's okay for the U.S., it's okay for China. China has reached a place in terms of its economic and its international influence at which it should be allowed, at which it should be Beijing's right to assert itself in ways that the U.S. has asserted itself. And of course, we have seen in terms of its corruption law and in terms of other elements of U.S. law that the U.S. has asserted a great deal of extraterritoriality, and much of that in the last couple of years has been aimed at China. And China, of course, is then moving back. I think those elements of the national security law are worrisome. We have not seen them employed yet, but this law is on the books and will remain on the books. At this point, obviously, the key elements of concern have been those that have affected people in Hong Kong directly. And you look at what's happened in terms of the very rapid movements to disassemble the press regime in Hong Kong. You look at the very rapid movements to disassemble the democratic opposition and the voices in support of a greater democratic voice in Hong Kong. The number, even as a journalist, when I'm looking to speak with it, we were just at June 4, the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre, and there was an effort to stamp out any overt signs of memorial or protest in Hong Kong, because in doing so, the images that once came out of Hong Kong were broadcast around the world of people on Chinese soil memorializing what had taken place. Those images no longer exist, and presumably in the future will no longer exist. And as a journalist in seeking to speak with people about that, many of the people that I was looking down my Rolodex, I was like, well, that person's in jail, that person's in jail, that person's in jail, that person's in jail. And the speed with which that is happening is quite breathtaking. And so I think that at this point is the chief concern of the national security law. And I suspect in terms of the extraterritorial aspects of it, we will see those first applied to people from Hong Kong in terms of what they do overseas. But of course, I mean, look at the other example in terms of what has happened to H&M, the clothier here, who was massively condemned and it was kicked out of various the malls where it operated in China after it made a statement against the use of cotton from Xinjiang. And what we saw there was a demand not just for a company to stop doing something, which is something that we've seen China do over the years. We saw China make such demands toward South Korea and Australia and that sort of thing. But in this case, there was a demand for a corporate sector to do something. And in this case, to openly embrace the use of cotton from Xinjiang. And that strikes me as very different. And as a demand for a compliance to a Chinese dictate to the international community. And I don't think that's the last time we have seen something like that.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to move on to questions from the audience right now. Margaret and I will alternate there. So Margaret, why don't you go ahead and ask the first one?
That's great, thanks. And I've got a few questions that came in advance as well. We've seen the leaking by Chinese officials of documents like the Caracas list of 311 Uyghurs showing presumption of guilt and guilt by association, and how the detention system planned to deal with each of them, which provided important insights into how their system is working. Does this kind of leak suggest dissent in the party with Xi's direction? And more generally, what governance challenges do you see facing Xi in the coming years?
I mean, I'm sure it suggests some dissent in the party, but whether it suggests any central dissent in the party or whether it is more an indication that there are Uyghur members of the Communist Party. And so there are members of the Communist Party who are also members of the ethnic group that has been the chief target of some of these policies here. And I suspect that you have a great deal of dissent from that community here in Xinjiang, as they have seen what has happened to friends and family and former professors and all the rest. In terms of the challenges to Xi's governance, I mean, I think one of the central ones is the maintenance of the value of the party to its people. And I think that has, over much of the last 40 years, been fairly narrowly defined in terms of, you know, the party's chief ambition was to create the kind of economic expansion that allowed people's economic livelihoods to get better and better. We have seen, of course, a slowing down of that rate of Chinese economic expansion, which is affecting the ways you know, people can expect their paycheck to increase year by year. And so how does the party shift from that in terms of towards creating a greater sense of well-being for its people? We've seen some success in that on the environment front. When I arrived in Beijing, it was still sort of smog apocalypse time. We don't see nearly as much of that, and the air is much improved in Beijing. It's been a considerable, it's not a full, but a considerable success by the party, and that of course is something that has a tangible impact on people's lives. But can that take place, and can people's sense of their lives improving, can that be maintained against a backdrop of increasing state intrusion in their lives and increasing state restrictions on their lives? And I think that's a balance that is going to be difficult to maintain. And I think how China manages its ability to stretch overseas, particularly at a time when inside of its own borders, it is asserting greater control. And what that means in terms of Chinese overseas investment, and how that Chinese overseas investment is seen, what that means in terms of China's soft power, such as it is, and how China is perceived, and what that means for China's ability to pursue its agenda overseas. I think those are key questions. And I think, you know, in terms of economic management, I think my sense is that China's challenge in that is not far off, frankly, the challenge that Western governments face, which is that we have seen a period where over the last number of decades, there has been, in China's case, deliberately in many ways, a very unequal accrual of economic benefit. And you now have, in places like Shenzhen in China, which is in many ways, one of China's more sort of economically forward cities. It's a place where people flock to in terms of its economic opportunities. But there you have now, at an average salary in Shenzhen, you're looking at 43 years to buy a 2-bedroom apartment. In the meantime, China is minting billionaires at a pace faster than any other country. And so these are very, very difficult questions. And we've seen some of the malaise over the direction of modern China being expressed by its young people. And I think that's potentially dangerous for China. I mean, some of the things that we've seen over the last few years are, we've seen university students trying to re-embrace the principles of Marxism and to create a Marxist critique of the modern Chinese state. And ironically, of course, by a Communist Party-led country, those students being smashed down by the state. But we've also seen a sense among students and among young people who are just getting into the workplace, that the hours that are expected of them relative to the returns they experience as opposed to their billionaire bosses are completely out of whack, and a real distaste for that. And I think some of those are important issues for the country, and speak to I think a growing disconnect between sort of the new generation and not just their corporate leadership, but also the country's political leadership.
Scott?
Okay, yeah, so I'm getting a few questions here about technology. One of them is, I'll blend these together here. One of them is that in order to maintain its surveillance state in Xinjiang and beyond, there are large companies that are publicly traded like Lian Technology, Hikvision, and Huawei. Is there anything we can do to hold them accountable? And I think related to that is that there's a lot of what somebody's calling techno nationalism here, with each country investing hugely in leading edge technologies. So how can Canada do something in this situation?
Well, in terms of the individual companies, I mean, the solution that has come forward is sanctions against some of those companies. Canada has done some of that, but has been reluctant to move against a lot of individual companies. But I mean, that is one way to do that, but it's difficult because these are big companies and in some cases global leaders in terms of what they do, and the ways surveillance cameras are used in Xinjiang can be very different from the ways they're used elsewhere, but the technology can be the same. In terms of techno nationalism, I mean, that is it's a very interesting trend in terms of what we're seeing, and it strikes me as what we're seeing is a real rise of a competitive space that's taking place in terms of both innovation policy, in terms of investment and research and development, which of course China is pursuing at a very rapid pace. And I think that creates a competitive space that, to go back to one of my opening remarks, in terms of we ignore China at our peril, I think there is a competition that is coming out of China. And I think it's, this is not a country that will necessarily fail at that. It may. We've seen elements where it has. I did a piece recently on China's ball bearing industry, which is in many ways to the industrial age what microchips are to the digital age. And China has, over the course of 70 years, failed to establish anything like a leading position in ball bearings. And so that does not augur well, perhaps, for microchips and other sort of fundamental technologies. But on the other hand, when I came here, you could have in 2013, you could have a reasonable conversation about whether China has created any real sort of leading international brands. And you can't have that conversation anymore. There are a number of Chinese brands that have become real leading international players. And so some of these things are happening very quickly. But what does that mean? I mean, do we end up in a place where we have a Chinese technology world and a Western technology world? Some of the trends that we're seeing now could perhaps eventually lead that way. But I mean, let's not forget that we still have an incredible mutual reliance in the technological sphere. I mean, we would not be using iPhones if it was not for manufacturing on Chinese soil. And there is no real future in sight at the moment for that not being the case. And so to what degree is that idea of decoupling overstated? I think it's probably overstated in a lot of areas. It's possible in some areas of technology we may see more of that taking place. But we live in a very sort of interwoven world, and I don't know how much we will see those two worlds separate.
In the early days of the app Clubhouse, we heard that Han Chinese were hearing what was really happening in Xinjiang from Uyghurs themselves, which may be why the app was banned in China within a couple of days. How are ordinary Chinese citizens viewing the Uyghur crisis? Or are they aware of it at all? And also, why are Chinese intellectuals silent on it?
Well, my sense is in many cases, the view is very supportive of Chinese national policies towards Xinjiang. The idea that what China has done in Xinjiang has created stability, that it has rooted out extremism, those have all been very, very popular. And there has the idea that China has ended some of the favorable policies that it has toward ethnic minority groups in terms of family planning and other areas. Those are all very, very popular. You get a sense of widespread resentment toward minority groups, that these people look what China does for them and why aren't they more grateful? And they live in China, why can't they speak Chinese? And why don't they embrace the current term of art is excellent culture? And my sense is that view is quite widespread. I did a piece at one point about a Han Chinese student who had a classmate who was Uyghur, and this Han Chinese student was just shocked at what she saw her Uyghur classmate experiencing in terms of everyday casual racism, even in a big city like Beijing. I mean, Uyghurs struggle to find a hotel that will take them in a city like Beijing. Hotels, when they have, every person in China has an ID card, and on that ID card is written their ethnic identity. When I checked into my hotel here in Xinjiang last night, there was a field that I had to write it. Well, I didn't have to write it because I'm foreign, but others would have to write it where it said, "What is your ethnicity?" When they want people to write that. And across China, if a Uyghur checks in, the hotel is often under orders to immediately notify the police that a person with Uyghur ethnicity has checked in. And some of that is very long-standing. And so this Han Chinese student wrote something online about this. She was horrified at what she was seeing, and the outrage online was just incredible. And people were just furious that this person was standing up for a Uyghur person. And so my sense is that the public, of course, state media doesn't report on a lot of things that the Western media has reported about in terms of what's taking place in Xinjiang. But B, is supportive. I mean, I've had conversations with the foreign ministry in China where, officials there, and by the way, many foreign ministry officials have been flown out to Xinjiang for some of the tours that we have seen, for example, Western diplomats take and diplomats from Muslim countries. The foreign ministry has also flown its own people out to Xinjiang for these tours because, of course, one of the questions that they immediately get asked when they defend what's happening in Xinjiang is, well, have you actually been there and seen? And so they've flown people out to do these tours. And so I've heard from people in the foreign ministry, they ask but come on, are you saying that like people in Xinjiang, Uyghurs are actually scared of China? Like just completely disbelieving that could be the case. When in fact, what you have is large parts of the populations in Xinjiang who are held in absolute terror by the state and what the state could do to them. And so there's just a complete unwillingness to contemplate that could even be possible.
So I'm getting some questions about your time in Xinjiang, and really looking on the ground, just your perspective from what you saw in your first time to Urumqi and now. Do you see any difference in terms of the presence of Uyghurs on the street and in public space?
No, I wouldn't say that. In Urumqi, what I would say is that there has been a real change in terms of the degree to which there is state presence. So the first time I came here, I was really struck by the fact that mosques, for example, when you would go by a mosque, there would often be very large physical establishments that were created there for a permanent security presence. So they'd effectively built bunkers with huge metal frames across from mosques that were staffed by heavily armed people. They would park armored personnel carriers literally facing the door of a mosque with people with submachine guns standing outside of in the opening of the armored personnel carrier. Looking in. Much of that is now gone, and it's gone in part because the mosques are either locked or basically in disuse. The idea of people going to the mosque in Xinjiang has largely disappeared. You can't get into mosques in Xinjiang without swiping an ID card, so there is a tracking, and there is a fear that the very idea of attending a mosque by a Uyghur person will be seen as a sign of extremism on their part. And so for example, the Idka Mosque in Kashgar, which is the largest mosque in China, there are now estimates 30 to 40 older men who occasionally go there to pray. But if you go to most mosques in China, they're either A, locked, B, locked with a scrolling LED panel on top that talks about Xi Jinping thought and its importance for religion. C, demolished and no more. I mean, there's lots of places in Xinjiang where you can go and you can look at previous street view images and you can see a mosque, and now there is either a construction site or a hole in the ground. Or D, you have mosques that are ostensibly open but effectively in disuse by the majority of the population. So that's a major change. The other change is that in 2017 and 2018, in 2019, you had just an incredibly muscular security presence. It didn't matter where you went in Xinjiang, you would see flashing lights. I mean, you could drive for hundreds of kilometers across Xinjiang and barely get a place if you're driving at night where you didn't see the flashing of police lights. In any sort of urban center, you would see police vehicles, and as well as sort of more armored vehicles doing very slow patrols down streets and turning around, so you're always within sight of a police officer. You would see security personnel stationed at street corners, often behind 4 or 5 foot tall, thickly built metal shields. I mean, it looked like a military occupation zone. Some of that has been shifted in some parts of Xinjiang now, where that heavy security presence has been lifted, and presumably there's still a heavy invisible security presence, but the visibility of it has been diminished. But I just got back. I was in Yining or Gulja, and traveled from there to a small place south called Jiaosu in Chinese, which is, and I was struck by the fact that heavy security presence remained. This was a very small center, and I mean, it felt like, I don't want to exaggerate, but maybe 1 out of every 5, maybe 1 out of every 6 or 7 cars was a police vehicle. I mean, it was just an extraordinary police presence. Many of them were doing these slow patrols as they did in the past. And then I came back at night to Yining and was having dinner at a small street side place when an alarm went off. And one of the presumably owners of the restaurant, a woman, went running inside and then came running back out wearing an anti-explosive protective vest and a metal helmet and a long wooden stick. And she went running down the street, and I went and followed her, and all other shopkeepers running there as well. And there were 3 police officers standing there, one of them holding a shotgun with his sort of finger playing with it. And these shopkeepers had to come literally brandishing these long wooden sticks like this, and they effectively formed a circular formation facing outward, waving their sticks as sort of an anti-terror drill. And this was something that you saw across Xinjiang in years past, and it remains. And of course, if the official narrative is to be believed, there is no terror threat whatsoever, but there remains these exercises remain in some places, I think in part, as an assertion, a continued assertion of the state's ability to order the people to do exactly what it wants to do.
So interesting discussion. I've got a question on a different subject. Campaigns are being mounted to boycott the 2022 Olympics, or move it, or not have government officials attend, or have athletes not attend the opening and closing ceremonies. Most of these campaigns are focused on the Uyghur genocide. Do you think the campaigns such as these could have an impact?
That's a hard question. I mean, what does it take to shift the way China does business? My sense is the attention that has been paid to what has been happening to the Uyghurs on an individual basis, in some cases where there have been individual cases that have attracted international attention. I think we have seen some evidence that in some individual cases that has resulted in perhaps better treatment for some individuals. We have seen this quote unquote graduation of large number of peoples from the re-education centers that has taken place after there was a great deal of attention that was paid to that. So my sense is some of the transparency and some of the ability to interrogate and expose what has taken place has perhaps had some limited effect on perhaps the most abusive situations in Xinjiang. But I'm not sure how much it has done to change the course of China's management of what's taking place in Xinjiang, because of course, from Beijing's perspective, it's been a roaring success. In terms of the Olympics, it seems clear to me that we are going to see some form of diplomatic boycott. We're certainly not going to see Prime Minister Trudeau in Beijing for those Olympics. Whether we see any Canadian official representation at all, or representation from other countries, remains to be seen, but my suspicion would be that that's unlikely. It also seems unlikely to me that we're going to see an athlete boycott. Whether there's wisdom in that, I don't know. I mean, I think, what we as Canadians probably need to know is that the opening ceremonies for the Winter Olympics in Beijing will take place less than 50 kilometers from where Michael Kovrig is being held. I mean, it's not just being in the same country. I mean, there's a great degree of geographic proximity. People who land at the Dasing Airport in Beijing, when they arrive, will be driving within a few kilometers of where he is being held as they go to where they're going. And so there's a very real proximity that's taking place there, and this will be happening at the same time as these policies in Xinjiang continue. Is it? I mean, the argument from the Canadian Olympic Committee and others is that it is not athletes' jobs to solve those problems, and if Canada is unwilling to halt its corporate interests, its corporate interactions, its trade interactions with China, why does it fall upon athletes to halt their interactions in China? Why is that the burden for athletes to bear? On the other hand, corporations often don't fly the national flag in the way that Olympians do, and there's a symbolic value to what happens with Olympians. Will we see Olympians be willing to speak out on behalf of what's taking place? I mean, we've already seen the Canadian Olympic Committee saying that it's warning people about the potential consequences to their own security of speaking out in China. So I don't know. These are very, very difficult questions, but it doesn't, at this point in time, I would say the likelihood of a Canadian athletic boycott doesn't seem to be all that high.
So you've had a lot of great stories, and one question that's come up here is it's really difficult to do genuine surveys in China. So how confident can we be that Xi Jinping has popular support? And what can we infer from that, from whether or not people stand behind his more nationalist agendas or threats towards people outside of China?
I mean, it's a very good point. We don't have good surveys. We do have surveys. You can, I suppose, you can question how good they are, but there are ongoing surveys, for example, in terms of public attitudes toward leadership, and some of those are done by Western institutions, and those have found a great degree of Chinese public support for its leadership, which of course is something that official China trumpets. I can tell you anecdotally, which of course is the wrong answer to a question about something more rigorously scientific. But I can tell you anecdotally, it does not matter where you travel in China these days. If you arrive with a foreign face, you will have people tell you unprompted how great China is. You will have people tell you unprompted how incredibly China has managed the pandemic. Because of course, let's not forget that, while China was slow in responding at the outset and there was the initial cover-up, China has effectively eradicated this virus from within its borders. It's used means that other countries have generally been uncomfortable with, but it's shown a great degree of success there. And what that has meant is that for much of the last year now, most of China has effectively lived a virus-free life. So this idea of other countries that are slowly moving towards opening up in China, I mean, that's very, very old news. I mean, planes are full, restaurants are full. I mean, it's effectively normal life here. And so that notion that the world, in a situation where the world was faced with a common threat, China was the country that really tackled it in a way that has led the world, that has really fed into a broader agenda of, if we can do this, we can do anything. And that has been, I think, very, very valuable for the Chinese party, but is also, I mean, I'm not sure if you think about this. I mean, if you lived in a country that had been the site of the opening stages of a global pandemic that shut down much of global function over a year, and your country had managed to eradicate that, I mean, I'm not sure that anybody could criticize you for feeling a great sense of pride in that. So I think there's a real legitimacy to that, and I think that goes to broader questions about the effectiveness of governance in China versus the way other countries are governing in certain situations, and I think those create real searching questions for other countries, in particular democratic countries. I mean, there is no reason that a country, well, that's not true. There are some reasons why a country like China could attack a pandemic in ways that Western countries couldn't, but there is no reason that China, I think, could have achieved results that were that much better than other countries. And in many ways, the pandemic was gift wrapped for China, because it turns out that what do you need to fight a pandemic? Well, you need to be able to exert very fine-grained social control. And what does China excel at? Well, it excels at exerting very fine-grained social control. I hadn't really understood how powerful that was and the degree to which that is baked into China until this pandemic. I mean, most people in China live in compounds that are surrounded by fences and accessible through a single or two or maybe three gates. These are not places that you can just walk into. You have to go through a gate. And in normal times, you swipe a card or you say, I'm going to visit a friend, and you go through. But the moment something happens, all of those gates become places that movement can be controlled across the entire country. And it's built into the very architecture of the country. So those are the areas where China can excel. That idea that China has been a world leader has been one that has been very, very potent, and I think has been very, very widespread in China. I don't think that it's a myth that there's a sense of national pride, and that is feeding into a much broader sense of what China is relative to the rest of the world today.
I've got a question for you that's come in for you in your role as a reporter. You've seen a lot of media colleagues leave China, and some from other countries who have left. It was in apparent retaliation for slights against China. You've also seen the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokespersons up close at regular briefings. Can you give us a sense of how the relationship of Chinese officials has changed over the years that you've been there, and how you're seeing that and experiencing it as a journalist?
I mean, it's interesting because the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is for many people outside of China, the side of China that they see, can be a very hostile organization, and has over the last few years been an organization that has decided it is both in China's interests and in the interest of individual diplomats to be seen as taking nothing unchallenged from other countries. This idea that China has arrived at a place where it no longer has to submit to foreign criticism, or it certainly no longer has to lie down and take foreign criticism, and that if it is punched, it will punch back every bit as hard, if not harder. That is a sort of an underlying way of doing business that, of course, has really changed the way China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has operated, the way it's changed here, and the way it's changed elsewhere. Some things are longstanding. I mean, this idea that China's rhetoric is hostile. In fact, if you go back and look at the way that China's spokespeople have spoken over the years, there's often been hostile rhetoric. But of course, now it's backed by a state that has a considerable more amount of power behind it. So it no longer, I mean, North Korea's rhetoric is hostile, but most people discount that. China can no longer be discounted in terms of what it says. So that's part of this as well. In terms of the way those relationships have changed, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, there has been a sense, a willingness to use journalists as a broader pawn in some of these games. China would say it was only responding that, the US kicked out Chinese journalists first, and then China responded by kicking out US journalists. But it goes beyond that, and it goes to a real sense of China asserting, well, the term that we've seen recently, which is this idea of discourse power, that China not only wants to be able to control what is said within its own borders, but is increasingly seeking to shape and to influence what is said about it outside of its borders. And one way to do that is to build its own television networks, which it's done. One way to do that is to work closely with friendly voices on YouTube and that sort of thing, which it has done. But another way to do that is to put pressure on foreign journalists who are inside China. And there are some developments there that I think are very, very worrying. We have seen a willingness to use the powers of the Chinese legal system to threaten what others are doing. We've seen very direct threats to sue individual journalists, including from the BBC. A good friend of mine at the BBC has been threatened with that he will be sued by the Chinese state. And of course, if you are living in China as a journalist and you're threatened with a suit, it's a very frightening prospect, because China routinely uses exit bans, for example, to prevent people from leaving the country. You can be locked in. Chinese courts have a conviction rate in the 99.9% range. So it is foreordained what the outcome is likely to be. We know that the Chinese carceral system is a system that is most people would say considerably abuses human rights. So all of these things are frightening, and the ways that we have seen those legal threats emerge, I think are of some concern.
Okay, we have to be careful of time, but I have a few questions here that look really interesting. One of them is asking if you see any parallels or differences with the residential schools in Canada. And I think that we're really having a difficult time in Canada wrestling with that. So do you see anything that's in China that would be similar or different, and how maybe ideas about truth and reconciliation apply there?
Yeah, I think those comparisons are completely inevitable. And China, of course, has been happy to leap upon that. This news of the discovery of the 215 bodies has been trumpeted by China as evidence that Canada has no leg to stand on when it comes to criticizing what China is doing. I think what we have seen from the Canadian side is something that long predates this. I mean, we have seen the Canadian leadership. One of the lines that has used toward China in terms of the Uyghurs is, listen, we've had this experience in our history. We know it doesn't work out. And learn from our mistakes. And so that's been one of the Canadian lines. But I think this idea of taking a large group of people and trying to form them into the state's conception of what a citizen should look like, this idea of taking a people and trying to force upon them a language, this idea of taking children outside of their parents' homes. All of these things have a great deal of resonance with some of what we've seen in Canada.
So yeah, go ahead, Margaret.
Oh, okay. I thought we were going on to one last question from me, and then perhaps one from Scott. In my own work on China's innovation system, I've watched as China moved from 28th to 14th in the Global Innovation Index in just 4 years. It's not yet in the top 10 of innovative countries, but we know that it has detailed plans to get there. At the same time, they're putting artificial intelligence into military applications, and we've seen what their surveillance companies are doing. How have you seen this innovation China in your own experience over the 8 years that you've been there?
I mean, I suppose the example that everyone reaches to because it's most tactile is when I came here. I mean, I would travel everywhere with a wallet that was like literally this thick. I mean, I couldn't sit on it because it was full of cash. It was a cash economy, and that's completely changed. I mean, most people in China don't travel with wallets at all now. It's almost an entirely digital economy to the point where if you try to pay with cash, people they'll accept it, but they probably won't be able to give you change in cash because they don't have any cash on them. They'll try to give you change digitally. And so that's been a real shift. And that's enabled a whole bunch of things, in terms of the online economy, your ability to access just about any goods that you want has been enabled by this, by the facility of payment for things with using digital money effectively. And so that's been a real shift. I think one of the things that I've been most struck by in China is I live in an area of China where there's a commercial and entertainment district called Sanlitun. And there is, I feel like if I want to know what shops are around me, I have to walk through this area at least once every 3 months because it changes so fast. And that idea of, if you're going to have lunch with someone in a part of town you haven't been to for a while, I mean, the first question you have to ask is, are any of those restaurants still open? Because it just moves so fast. It's such a fast changing place. And the willingness to adopt new things, I mean, to abandon cash in favor of something else, almost at the snap of a finger, is extraordinary. And I think in terms of China's innovation, that ability to find a receptive consumer base, I think, is a real Chinese strength, because you don't have, I think, as much conservatism in adopting new things in China as you might have in other countries. I think one of the key constraints on Chinese innovation, I think, remains their education system. There remains an education system that does not promote creative thought, that in general, and I'm talking in broad strokes, it's an enormous country, there are exceptions to all of these things, but in general promotes sort of reciting learning and sort of the memorization of facts, as opposed to sort of processing information and coming to new conclusions out of it, which is the kind of thing that doesn't work well for innovation. China has excelled at engineering. It has historically not been as good at creating sort of entirely new inventions. But I mean, how many people use TikTok now? I mean, the algorithms behind that are sophisticated, and the idea behind that is sophisticated, and that comes from China. And I think we can't ignore that.
So thank you, Nathan, for spending the morning with us on your day when you're going to catch an airplane in 2 hours after this. Thank you for your important work, your service for Canada, for the world. I think it's an important distinction, as somebody brought up here, that you're one of the few reporters left from North America in China. And I think we're getting a lot of questions here about your career. What took you to China in the first place? How has it been there as a prominent Canadian? Do you feel in danger? What's it like there? What are the positive sides of things as well? So I think we have just a few minutes, but if you could, in about 3 minutes, let us know, and then say something about where you're going next.
Yeah, sure. So I came to China in 2013. I had previously, like Margaret mentioned at the outset, I'd worked in Yellowknife and in Calgary and in Vancouver, doing a variety of roles. But I'd always wanted to go overseas, and this opportunity came up. And I had first come to China in 2008 on a reporting fellowship when I was writing for the Financial Post, and I was writing. At that point in time, there was a large Canadian forestry delegation that had come to China in the wake of the devastating Sichuan earthquakes. And one of the things they had done was to try to sell more Canadian 2x4s, saying, wooden houses don't shatter in an earthquake the way concrete houses do. I enjoyed my time. I actually spent a few weeks here, and then my wife joined me, and we spent a few weeks traveling across China. And then an opportunity came to come back, and of course I said yes. I was worried because I knew how important China was. It was my first foreign post, and it felt like an enormous step to take. I was also worried that I had missed the China story in some ways, which of course seems horribly naive in retrospect. But if you think about the story that led up to 2008, sort of post WTO accession, towards the Beijing Olympics, the story of sort of go China, of sort of the breakneck expansion of China, and thousands of kilometers of new high-speed rail and new buildings, and sort of this optimism of sort of a surging and interesting and fascinating place, that it felt to me like that the breakneck expansion and all of that was sort of in the past by the time I landed. As it turns out, I arrived roughly around the same time Xi Jinping took power, and that has been the defining element of China today, and presumably for decades into the future. And so I'm glad I was able to spend some time writing about that. I mean, as a place to be, it's interesting. I've had a number of conversations with the foreign ministry here. They like to call in journalists, and there's always this kind of like loyalty testing question they like to ask, which is, well, what do you think of China? Do you like China? And my response is always, well, I love China. I mean, I choose authentication in China. It's this brilliant, enormous place with brilliant food and magnificent scenery and all these other things. Of course, that's not actually the question they're trying to ask. What they want to ask is, what do you think of China's governance system? Which, I think you can have very different opinions about. I mean, it's as a journalist, there's no place like it. It's interesting. It's important. It's just full of stories, really, and full of interesting people and all of these other things. And I think it touches people at home in ways that other countries don't. So I have a pair of 9-year-old twins, and people have been asking them as we prepare to leave, like, what do you feel? And one of my boys, Callum, keeps saying, well, it's bittersweet because it's bitter and it's sweet. And I feel very much the same way. I mean, I've spent the better part of 8 years here, and I'm glad to be going on to new things. I'll be a U.S. correspondent for the Globe going forward, writing about issues primarily on the western coast of the United States, which of course is big and exciting. But it also feels like I'm leaving behind something very important. And part of me hopes that I'll be able to come back at some point.
Well, thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank Margaret McQuaid-Johnston, all the event coordinators, Christina Warren, Anna Bojic, Carolina Shimada, Sam Amoa. I'd like to thank, of course, Nathan for this wonderful presentation. And I'd like to thank everybody who's attending as well. I do apologize for not being able to get to all of the questions. There are simply too many of them. They're very good. I tried to combine them as I could. And I thank you all for being here. And I wish everybody a good evening and a good day for those who are in Asia. Thank you, everybody.